just for the hell of it. And we will go on from there. Okay. All right, a couple of things to cover. First of all, and Quinn reminded me of this, we had a meeting earlier and we were talking about it. And so that I don't forget, I wanted to talk a little bit about, just briefly, about something I mentioned earlier, which was the 371 class that I'm teaching in the spring. I got some really interesting feedback from a couple of you. I'm not like shamelessly pandering for this class. If the enrollment's low, I'm going to teach it anyway, and they'll have to shoot me or something. But it seemed, of those of you who responded, there seemed to be a pretty profound interest in doing something to do with political extremism, political violence. But again, not looking at, oh, well, what do the political scientists who analyze this stuff dispassionately say, but what were the mobilizing ideas? And if you have other ideas or readings that you'd like to look at, here are some things I thought about. And I mentioned this to Quinn, and I mentioned this to another of your colleagues from another class earlier this morning in a meeting. One of the people who just isn't read anymore, and I think it's a great shame, is Rosa Luxemburg. And I pretty much am committed to including good old Rosa Luxemburg in whatever we do, because, I mean, first of all, very few women are allowed to speak in political philosophy prior to about 1975 or 1980. It's just, and that's really the beginning of feminist theory. But beyond that, she's an anarchist. She wasn't shy about violence. It's an interesting read. She's a bit of a clunky read, as most political philosophers and theorists are, but I'm looking for a good, concise source of her readings that I could assign. I think it would be useful, and we'll talk about it a little bit in this class. I think it would be useful to look at Frantz Fanon. Again, a guy who absolutely and emphatically not only advocated violence, but was, kind of involved in a violent insurrection in Algeria himself. And so, and yet had this interesting perspective on it as a trained psychiatrist. So his readings are always kind of intriguing, and you can argue with them, but I think I mentioned this before, every time I pick up Frantz Fanon, I want to read more. I want to be better, when I read old Frantz. So that's a possibility. I thought about Marx. The problem with Marx is that Marx doesn't really give us much in the way of kind of revolutionary calls to action. That's usually the anarchists and people like that. And then finally, I want to get somebody on the really violent right, probably from the late 19th century to early 20th century. Again, I mentioned this to a couple of people. I don't want to assign Mein Kampf. I really don't. One thing, it's an incredibly it's like, I'm going to say something really mean here. It has nothing to do with ideology and everything to do with self-involvement. It would be like reading Donald Trump's political memoir, where it's all about him and his struggles and no one understands him. And then, of course, very quickly he deflects that onto, Jews and lesser people and all this really putrid stuff. But that is what lights people's fire on the right. A combination of victimization, the evil of intruding forces of modernity. And so what I'm looking for is, and there are a couple of people I'm looking at, people who actually talk about the degree to which the Nazis in particular were influenced by thinkers and readers of theosophy and the occult and the OTO and things like that. Yeah, Cole?
I'm not sure if I share a similar interest in this, but what about Jeremy Bentham and James Mills?
I don't see either one of those people really advocating violence. And I don't see their ideas as being, the kind of extreme, neither one of those I would describe as an extremist in the sense that we're talking about. I mean, they just don't stand up to Hitler. They just don't. They fall flat. They don't stand up to Frantz Fanon. I mean, they're still appealing to rationality and reason and all that. The kind of people that I'm talking about are people who, for example, a classic example might be you know, we might do a go around with Nietzsche or something like that, because Nietzsche clearly had contempt for the common herd, and the notion of the Übermensch, you know, the Superman and all that stuff. That might help us on the right. Clearly, that influenced the Nazis. Also, it's post-rationalism, the notion of beyond good and evil and all that. It's the idea that there is a way of looking at the world beyond being rational. That is, you're so dispassionate that you're just brutal. So on my little list here that I was putting together this morning, I've got little Freddie Nietzsche on there. But if you can think of someone who I just maybe haven't thought of, that might be really kind of somebody we could get, say, I don't want to saturate you with readings, okay? And it gets expensive, but what I might be able to do is kind of what I've done with this class. That is, we'll take sections of their work, and I can copy it and post it online. And then for those of you who want to take a deeper dive, you can actually purchase a copy of the work. Most of the works of these people you can pick up for next to nothing, you know, on eBay or something like that, or in electronic form on, you know, Amazon, or you know, the iTunes thing that actually downloads books and stuff. So I don't see this as being super expensive, but I just wanted to remind you maybe to think about that a little bit. And insofar as you either are thinking, yeah, what you were talking about is cool, or if you didn't do that, what about something like this? That might be helpful as well. There are some other there are some radical thinkers from different parts of the world we might look at. There are some Latin American liberation theology people and some Latin American anarchists who might be fun to look at. And what I guess the common denominator would be that these are people who are trying to mobilize people to action out of a kind of desperation, pull out all the stops, it's now or never, crush them kind of stuff, okay? And historically, most of that has been on the right. Most organized political violence historically has been on the right. If you even think about the French Revolution, yeah, a lot of the ideas were kind of progressive, but if you look at the forces that were mobilized, the French Revolution was a revolution really of the affluent middle class over the aristocracy, of the merchants over the princes. And that was happening at various times all over Europe. So it's just, people on the left just seem to be a little timid about actually breaking people's fingers and stuff. I don't know what the problem is. You know, it's like, you got to get in there and get your hands dirty, you know, got to do the wet work, as they used to say. Or at least that's what they used to say in Vietnam. Okay, not that I was ever there. All right, so anyway, something to think about. Any questions on that? All right, now, in addition to that, I wanted to talk a little bit about the case studies again. And I got to thinking about this when I was looking at your sort of virtual journal entries that you're pretty much all of you are doing. A couple of you have kind of blown the assignment off. It will come back to haunt you, but that's your problem and none of our own, right? Everybody makes choices. Also, some of you, I understand, are doing this in a different form and you're transferring that, and I'm not holding that against you, but what I'm talking about are people who've actually made entries and yet they're just sort of, there's not much there, okay? One of the things that I noticed, okay, is there are still a few of you you're still excreting this kind of poisonous bile when you get into this. That is, you're not even, this has nothing to do with what House says, or, you know, what we're going to talk about with Reinhardt or anybody else. You just still have this kind of poisonous attitude about, you know, empires and colonies and all that. Very 21st century, very millennial, very tedious and very historically inaccurate. Okay, so I'm asking you to stand down from that a little bit. I mean, yeah, understand, I'm not saying you're not entitled to your views. What I'm saying is those views, man, they don't cut ice when it comes to scholarship. That's not scholarship, okay? And I'm asking you to learn. I'm not asking you to preach, okay? When you're done here and you get your diploma and you go out on the street, fine. You go out and you evangelize for, you know, hateful white people, hateful Europeans, and all the evil people we know are out there. That's wonderful, but not on my dime, okay? Because that's not learning and that's not teaching. And it's certainly not what I'm trying to teach. And it's not what Howe's trying to teach. And it's not what Kennedy is trying to teach. And it's not what Reinhardt's trying to teach. They're trying to give you a sober but relatively dispassionate analysis of these hugely influential transformative institutional phenomena that happen all over the world and change the world. Okay, and they're trying to do it without just saying, and of course we know that everyone with pale skin is evil. You know, I mean, how often have we seen this? You know, race was used as a mobilizing agent in colonialism, but it wasn't why people went out looking. Okay, it's just, you know, when you talk about, you know, colonialism, you say, well, this was just because, you know, white people do this and that, and, you know, Europe is evil and all that. I mean, come on, really? It's just as silly and useless as saying, well, we know that, you know, all modernization is the only way to go, and if you're not modern, you're evil or you're stupid. It's just as bigoted. It's just as closed-minded. It's just as useless. Okay, I don't want to have to say it again, but I've told you this before. When I see that kind of clearly labeled editorial opinion, I just don't count that, because you don't hear me doing it. Okay. You don't. I'm not trying to justify anybody, and I'm not trying to attack anybody. I'm just trying to make sure that, you know, we know what we'd have to do, what we'd have to look at to go out trying to figure out what happened, why did it happen the way it happened, and what were the consequences of that. There's not a lot of morality in those questions. There just isn't. Okay. So that's, I mean, you know, again, yes, you're entitled to your opinions. Do they cut any ice in this class? No, they don't. They don't count at all. Your opinions are not important any more than mine are. Not in this class. Out on the street, yeah, we've got opinions and we have a beer and we talk about it, and that's fine. And then, you know, if I'm over at Omar's and I'm talking about Democrats, I end up getting in fights, which is why I don't go to Omar's anymore, because Democrats have no sense of humor and they all think they can still fight, and none of them can, for the reason I just pointed out. People to the left, center are gutless. You know? So there you go. I'm old, but I'm not that old. Okay, but what I want you to start doing, and a couple of you have done this, is get an idea of, okay, I need a case study here. And one of the things one of the kind of administrative fictions I thought might be useful for you is imagine yourself as working for some non-governmental organization or something like that. And what you're trying to do is look at so-called developing or less developed countries or whatever. That's where you're going to find most of your good case studies of colonialism, because they're recent, okay? And decide, okay, I'm going to look at this. Now, there's a problem. One of you asked me about Ethiopia, okay? Why doesn't Ethiopia really work? There's a really good reason for that. Anybody?
Ethiopia was its own independent country, maybe like its own kingdom, until it was conquered in World War II.
Yeah, and it was never really colonized. See, parts of Somalia and Eritrea were colonized. Ethiopia wasn't. Okay. And so it doesn't really fit. Now, if you wanted to do Somalia, or you wanted to do Eritrea, or you wanted to do, I don't know, maybe Djibouti or something like that, you could do that. But Ethiopia really doesn't fit what we're talking about. Ethiopia was complicit in many ways in the so-called scramble for Africa. Okay, you know, as long as you didn't try too hard, you know, to mess with Ethiopia, they didn't care, you know. So pick one way to do this is decide, okay, is there a region of the world where I've got some interest? Yeah, okay. All right, within that region of the world, is there a country where either I know enough that I could go ahead and do something interesting here, or I don't know anything about this and I'm curious? Okay. You probably won't come up with too many cases where I'll just say there just isn't enough written on that. You're gonna die. There's nothing there for you. Okay. What I would also suggest that you do is I'm going to go ahead and put up a link later in the term, not right now. Okay. And what you're going to be doing is you're going to be using that link. It'll be a journal like what you've had for the Module 1 readings. Okay. And you're just going to be dumping into that. Here's the stuff I found so far. What it allows me to do is track along with you what your research is starting to look like. Because then if I have suggestions or something, you know, I can be more useful to you. The other thing that I would really recommend, because there aren't that many of you, is that at some point you make a one-on-one appointment to meet with me on Zoom so we can talk about your case. You know, and we can figure out, well, what do you have now? What do you still need? Where might you go to find that? Okay. I'm not going to require it, but I'm going to emphasize that it will help you. Okay. I don't think any of you are sufficiently expert now to just immediately go out and do, a slam dunk analysis of a former colony. If you were, you would probably be in graduate school right now. All right. So are there any general questions about the assignment? If you look at the syllabus, you'll see here that, I pointed out there, here are the things I want you to account for. We can go over that again later. We're still a little early to do that. We still have to do the module 2 readings, which we will begin today. But just in general, in terms of what I'm asking you to do, some sort of an analysis of what was this area like before it was colonized, under what circumstances and for what reasons was it colonized and by whom, all right? And then what was the nature of the anti-colonial struggle? Then, insofar as you've got sufficient confidence to do it, if you want to talk a little bit about, as a consequence of colonialism, here are some of the kind of things that are legacies of that colonialism, you can do that. You are not required to do that, but all other things being equal on an assignment, if you also do that, just to put it crudely, you're going to get a higher grade, But you could still do quite well without doing that. All right. Are there any questions?
Yeah, I have a question. I apologize if this is addressed in the syllabus, but like, say your the country you choose has a very long and detailed history with its colonizer. How far back and how deep should we go for this analysis?
Well, remember that you're functionally acting as the expert on this case. So what you have to do is decide for yourself, at what point does this history become relevant? In other words, how many cases can you think of where there was a very long history between two sovereign entities that ultimately led to colonialism, where after centuries, perhaps, one colonized the other? That's not very common. Particularly in the last 150 years, it's not very common. So what were you thinking of, Graham?
Oh, my specific case is Ireland.
Well, see, one of the problems you're going to run into with Ireland is that it's not exactly Ethiopia, but Ireland's kind of been, you could argue that the Romans tried to colonize Ireland and then they thought that it was really cold and shitty and so they left. Now, does that mean that colonialism failed? And does that have anything to do with the subsequent colonial relationship, such as it was between, England and Ireland? You're going to have to decide that. So the first thing is, obviously, I think you could leave Rome out of the equation. In that case, you're not really going back all that far, if you think about it, in terms of actual colonialism. But the better way to answer that question might be to wait until we more clearly define what we mean by colonialism. That might help you know what the cutoff is going to be. It's a fair question. It's an unusual situation in that most of the circumstances you're going to look at are not going to involve an extended period of history between two countries where one wasn't already kind of subservient to the other. Okay. And I would suggest to you that the situation isn't really much different with Ireland, but you might disagree with that when you get more deeply into it. But let's hold that in abeyance for now. It's a perfectly legitimate question, but we may revisit that after we've had another class or two where we actually discuss, well, what are the moving parts of what we are going to decide we recognize as colonialism? Okay, we're not going to use it metaphorically. We're not going to use it in terms of saying that, oh, you're trying to colonize us with your literature or that kind of stuff. Cultural colonialism. We're not really interested in that here. It might be perfectly legitimate in another subject matter. It doesn't really fit here. Okay, for reasons that I hope will become clear. Okay, partly because we're trying to, insofar as we can, to strip this analysis of, ideological assumptions and biases. And when you start invoking things like cultural colonialism and stuff like that, as opposed to influence, you're already conceding a bias. You may not be doing it explicitly, but you're revealing it. Not you, Graham, but one who does that will be doing that. We're going to try to avoid that. Okay. All right. Are there any other questions so far on anything we've talked about so far? Okay, then what I want to do is kind of bridge into the readings in Module 2 And there are two there really. The one is just a short piece. It's about 3 pages, I think. It's a book review on the scramble for Africa, because a lot of you, I come to find out, have never heard of what the scramble for Africa was. And even if you're not really interested in doing something in sub-Saharan Africa, looking at this kind of relatively short period of time in which an entire continent was just carved up between European powers, in part to try to avoid war, by the way, it's kind of interesting. But we're going to be talking pretty much today, we're going to spend most of our time talking about Reinhardt's book, and that's this short history of colonialism. It's really quite a good book. I think I picked this up for $4, and it's like a new book. I can't guarantee you're going to be able to find it for that, but it's an absolutely smashing read, you know. And in the meantime, all right. But if you look at the Moodle site, the first thing that's mentioned there is Machiavelli. Now, I'm not at all trying to suggest that prior to Machiavelli, there was no theory of colonialism and there was no colonialism. That's not what I'm saying. Obviously, we're leaving Rome out of the picture. The difference, I think, and where Machiavelli becomes useful for us is, first of all, most of you are familiar, or at least you think you're familiar with Machiavelli, and that there's something about kind of brutal practicality in Machiavelli's writing, at least in the Prince, if not in the discourses, okay? But more than that, Machiavelli offers a kind of functional explanation of colonialism in chapter 3 of the Prince that I think is consistent with most of what we're going to find, okay? In chapter 3, I'm going to read directly from this so you get what I'm talking about. And sort of look for the tone here as well, but look for this strain of practicality that's peculiar to Machiavelli. A prince does not spend much on colonies, for with little or no expense, he can send them out and keep them there. And he offends a minority only of the citizens from whom he takes lands and houses to give them to the new inhabitants. And those whom he offends, remaining poor and scattered, are never able to injure him, whilst the rest, being uninjured, are easily kept quiet, and at the same time are anxious not to err for fear it should happen to them as it has to those who have been despoiled. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, Nicky Machiavelli. I mean, you know, this is him at the peak of his powers. It's like, yeah, just go ahead and take it. What are they going to do about it? They're poor, they're wretched, and they're afraid of you. I mean, that's classic Machiavellianism. But look at the strain of practicality that informs that. Okay, first of all, he's saying, this isn't going to cost, if you do it right, this isn't going to cost you a lot. Okay? You know, that there, and also there's a reason for doing this. What's the reason? To expand the throw weight of your realm, to project force. Okay, in other words, you're using these colonies as outposts of your principality from which you can continue to expand your influence, which of course is perfectly benevolent because you're the prince, right? But the idea also that you're not going to offend that many people, and the ones you do aren't going to be able to do anything about it. Okay, what do you think about that? Other than, gee, that sounds really mean, those white people. That's not.
I guess that kind of informs, like, I think earlier colonial like habits where you'd send out like a relatively small number of people, go like, hey, this is your land now, just earn some money for the home state and you'll be good. And just like set somebody up, give them like some land holdings in the capital of whatever country it is that you just ended with your dominion on, and then go like, oh, earn some money for us and we'll be all good.
Well, yeah, but by that you mean either, you know, expropriate from that area something of value for us and bring it back to us, you know. And that, again, is expanding the sort of throw weight of the dominion. But also, I mean, there is a weird kind of naivete there about the rest of the world. Remember that his theory of colony at the time that he's writing, right, it's still largely informed by the Eurasian landmass, okay? But what Kyle is suggesting, if I understand you, Kyle, is this is a kind of mindset that prevailed with the major metropolitan centers of Europe well into the 19th century. That this wasn't an ancient view of the world, that this essential notion of pragmatic expansion through colonialism in the pursuit of empire was just kind of accepted as, of course, it's inevitable and perfectly logical and practical. Colonies aren't that expensive. And in many ways they aren't, especially if there's something of value in the area that you're colonizing, because then the colony is more than paying for itself. A couple of you, I think, might have misunderstood what I was trying to talk about with the theory, to which I only partially subscribe, of imperial overstretch. And the idea that some of you were suggesting is, well, you know, if you expand too far, you can't afford it anymore. That's not necessarily the problem. It isn't that the colonies don't continue to yield wealth. Okay, it's becomes more of an administrative burden. In other words, beyond what point does the rule of law become stretched so thin that it fails to yield? It's very seldom that modern colonial possessions are lost because the people went broke. It's usually as a consequence of a massive destabilization like war. Okay, for example, during the decade or so of the Depression and prior to World War II, right? None of the European powers lost their colonies, even though every one of them had its central economy damaged, if not shattered, by that depression. So it's this notion, and we'll get to it in a time, of sort of, oh, colonies become expensive, isn't necessarily borne out by history, okay? And it's the very reason for the colony itself, it pays for itself, okay? Because initially, there's something there that the metropole values, that it can extract from the core, right? And that the cost that it can realize on that thing of value is much greater. The value of it is much greater than what it actually cost them to take it out of the periphery. Okay. Otherwise, colonialism would never work. Okay. So this Machiavellian notion, though, is, I would suggest, a good starting point for the modern mindset of the aspirant to colonial empire, which is, this is a pretty quick and dirty way for me to expand the realm, and to expand commercially, and to expand militarily, okay? Now, if you go deeper into Machiavelli, he does caution you about the risks of going in and trying to occupy or colonize a place that has an established principality to it, okay? Because then you run into the people in whose interest the preservation of the original principality might stimulate resistance. That is, if you go into a settled area that has an established kingdom or something like that, right, they're going to try to resist. Whereas if you just go and colonize people who are sort of, think of the Germanic tribes, that Rome went in and kind of vacuumed up until, it ran into geographic problems as much as anything else, environmental problems. There was no central authority there that you had to destroy. You just had to cut off a few big blonde heads, and then you kind of could control the turf. Suddenly that forest was yours, or at least you wanted to believe it was. Go watch Gladiator again, because that opens in those Germanic wars against those Germanic tribes, and isn't that a wonderful way to acquire territory? But again, the idea here is that you have this kind of self-contained pragmatic logic embedded within which is a justification. You're really not discommoding or inconveniencing that many people because they're wretched and poor and they're not going to do anything anyway. And the rest of the people are either perfectly happy with what you're doing, or they're significantly afraid of you. They're not going to do anything about it. And in the meantime, you've managed to expand the realm and you are now more powerful. That's empire, okay? And that kind of thinking is where most of I would say, the princes of the time, of Machiavelli's time and after that, all the way up to, the prime ministers and, the British crown and everything else, this was their thinking. Of course we can do this. Why? Because we can. Oh, yeah, well, yeah. Not like, should we? It was like, well, of course we can. And of course we're entitled to it because we're superior. We demonstrate our superiority by the very fact that we were able to colonize these people. It's this kind of self-perpetuating logic and pragmatism, okay? It's powerful stuff, Okay. I'm not interested in the morality of it at all. I'm really not. I don't care. All those people are dead now. I just don't care. What interests me is that this is an engine that changed history, and it did it in a very brutal way. But when do human beings not do something that involves brutality ultimately? Okay, so that's the first thing to think about before we get into Reinhardt, is that long before the British Empire or anything like that, Europe had this established notion, and by the way, so did the Middle East, so did the Ottomans, to some extent the Turks. I mean, this, you could go back to Xerxes if you want to. There was always this notion of, well, of course, Alexander, you just keep expanding and acquiring territory because you have culture to spread and you have all these cool things and you have a lot to offer. That was the original ethos behind Athenian colonialism. Greek colonialism was Alexander was actually going out on an early notion of a kind of civilizing mission. Well, guess what? That to some extent is exactly what was going on. It's just, is it still civilization when it's civilization at the tip of a spear? That's a whole nother discussion. And we're not going to go back that far in history, because I think I would argue that is a similar but distinct era of colonialism that doesn't quite fit into our analysis now. Sort of more or less modern empires and colonialism. Now, Reinhardt gives us this wonderfully concise little history, and that introductory chapter is very brief. I mean, that's you read that in one sitting, and then you maybe read it again in a week or something, and you've got it. Okay, but I actually made notes on this. Oh gosh, Jennifer Burks is sitting there, and I didn't see it. 1 second, because I have to apologize when she comes in. Jennifer, can you hear me? No, she's not quite here yet. Hold on. Come on. Oh, I can't tell. Jennifer, are you there? We will never know. It's a great secret. All right. Anyway, over the summer when I was thinking about this, I referred to his approach as strenuous amorality. Okay. Which is mine. That's the way I look at things. I am not possessed of morals when it comes to the work I do. I just don't care. Okay. That's part of what a lot of people refer to as dispassionate scholarship. In other words, I don't do this scholarship because I'm passionate about punishing someone or rewarding someone or changing the world. I do it because I'm really curious. And that's the spirit with which I hope you can go into this. You will learn more if you, to the extent that you can do that. Okay. But when he's describing and defining colonialism, all the way right at the beginning on page 1, he refers to it as one people's control over another people through economic, political, and ideological exploitation of a development gap between the two. I think I mentioned this last class. The key to Reinhardt's notion of colonialism, not the only element, but the key without which it won't work, is this notion of a gap that exists between the capacity of one as opposed to the other to occupy and displace and conquer and so on. Okay. It doesn't mean that in every way one people are superior to another. And he's very clear about that. All right. He knows that some people are going to see, oh, this is a bias. This development gap means that he's saying that, it's kind of racist. It includes, it suggests that like white Europeans are superior to the people they colonized, or that industrialized societies are better than pre-industrial or non-industrial societies. That's not what he's saying. But it's really hard to find an example of anything that just objectively that we could recognize as colonialism that doesn't involve what Reinhardt's talking about, that gap that exists in the level of development in terms of the capacity to control territory, okay? Usually, but not always, involving weaponry, but also economically. Because, colonies, Machiavelli might say that colonies are relatively cheap, right? That in fact, you don't spend much, but you got to spend something. And also, you've got to have an economic infrastructure in place that allows you to make profitable and productive use of the things you extract from the periphery. Otherwise, the colonies have no value to you, okay? Any questions so far? Everyone's been really quiet. It usually means you're bored out of your skull, or you're confused, or you're just generally hating the fact that you're here. There very seldom is a fourth option. Okay. Let's see. All right. So what he's trying to say is, and I mean, come on, he's as careful as he can be. He's almost apologetic in saying, I'm not talking about moral superiority. I'm not talking about some people being good and some people being bad. Okay. And he also is trying to avoid oversimplification, right? He's trying to remind us, yeah, you know, we can define this thing, and the definition he gives is pretty elegant. You can capture it in a sentence. It's kind of got all the moving parts there. Okay. But then he tries to go into these, what I refer to sometimes as conceptual coordinates. In other words, you've got to plot out your model in this way in order to understand how this phenomenon really works. Okay. So one of the things he emphasizes is what he refers to as alterity. What does that mean? There's the two things, the two keys to that model are alterity and differential development. Differential development involves that gap, but what is alterity? Somebody, you know, I mean, come on, you're supposed to have smart devices to substitute for your own thinking. What is alterity? Look it up. You're college students. Everybody here is really smart. What's that?
It's like
How do you
being
spell it?
different or otherness.
Well, you've read it, right? You've all read this already, right? Because you knew you had to.
It's just the state of being different.
Yeah, it's the state of being different, the awareness of that. It's that notion that sometimes is called, some people in a normative sense call it othering, right? I don't like when people take a noun and make it a verb, but that's the 21st century and I may hate it, but I'm trapped in this world and can't get out of it. Okay, but it is that notion of us and them, of the other. And, you know, that is, we talked about this a little bit before when we were talking with Hal, when we were talking about how a colonial empire based on colonial acquisition and control is complex. It's sort of multi-ethnic, it's diverse, right? Because you're going from the core and you're projecting outward, but not just to one place and straight back. You're projecting outward, sort of fanning out. And if you think about, say, Spain and Portugal in the so-called voyages of discovery, right? That landmass from even just roughly from the Caribbean south, that's an enormous amount of territory and ocean. So you have these two empires sort of fanning out there and spreading their influences to various locales, and then subsequently, of course, fighting over it and things like that. All right. So this notion of alterity, all right. Reinhardt envisions colonialism as this sense of, there's a real conscious sense of the colonizer as distinct from the colonized. Okay. Some of this is going to sound familiar. We're reinforcing some of what Howe was saying. Okay. He's saying it more categorically. That is, rule, he says on page 1, rule must be experienced as alien rule. By the way, for those of you who didn't know the spelling of alterity or anything else, we're just on page 1 of Reinhardt. Okay. So you see what I'm saying? I mean, if you're going to read, you got to read. It's just, but even like the first page, Reinhardt gets in and gives you a lot to play with. All right. So he's not saying that you necessarily have to go in sort of at the barrel of a gun and dominate, even though Howe suggests as well too, that is not uncommon. But there is clearly a distinction that is made and that is reinforced, usually juridically, right, between the minority that colonizes and the majority who are being colonized within their home territory. That's alterity in its extreme with respect to colonialism. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now, he's also cautioning us, it doesn't mean that the colonial ruler is just overwhelmingly dominant and that all the colonized people are just curled up in a fetal position and being victims of colonialism and terrified to resist, as Machiavelli suggested. In fact, he's saying, no, if that were true, every one of those colonies would probably still exist, but they don't. Okay, and in part, that's because the notion of the kind of either transparent or passive colonized is a myth. It's wrong. Machiavelli was wrong about that. And history has proven him wrong consistently over centuries. People resent occupation. They don't like it, okay? So that's really important. But again, I would say that it's accurate to say that for Reinhardt, the essence of colonial rule is alien rule. The other is ruling, okay? Are there any questions on that or concerns? Now remember, this is not my point of view. This is Reinhardt. And he's really emphasizing that if you want to understand colonialism, there has to be this notion of us and them and alien rule, an alien occupying force, something from outside that's not from there and that's not of there. It's not there linguistically, whatever, I don't like the word racially, but whatever you want to call it, right? Ethnically, linguistically, historically, in no way do you see these people, finding much common ground. Okay. Yeah, Quinn.
So when I was reading, it referred to, I made a note of the exact part. When he was talking about Wales and I think England as an example about how when it stops being alien, then it's no longer colonial rule.
Right.
What exactly happened? Did they just fully absorb Wales? I'm confused about that specific example because I'm not super familiar with the history of Wales. But so what happens also on a general scale if a country or if a colony, if it stops being an alien rule and starts being like they fully assimilate? What happens?
Well, ultimately, they probably don't. We are no longer fully assimilated into Britain. We don't speak English. We speak American. We look at the Brits as silly, but secretly smarter than us. We have better teeth than them, and we're better looking than them. But they're smarter than us. We invent more cool things than them. We're clearly us and them, okay? But we've sort of, we've declared independence from them. What you're talking about is the opposite of that. When that internal sense of alterity, well, it may not vanish, is minimized beyond some critical point where it ceases to function as colonialism, according to Reinhardt. That is a perfectly legitimate question. Graham, remember when I said we would come back to that with Ireland? What Quinn is asking about is that. And that's one of the things that you're going to have to decide is that what happened with Ireland to some extent? Or did it never happen there? Clearly, a lot of people would argue it did happen with Wales. And yet, if you know anything about Wales and the Welsh, they still claim for themselves a pretty extraordinary amount of sort of cultural sovereignty, linguistic sovereignty, and things like that. They didn't stop being Welsh, okay? I think that what Reinhardt would argue there is that the alterity ceased to function as part of the power dynamics. The difference wasn't the thing, that made for alien rule. In other words, it was kind of normalized ultimately over centuries, right? As being a kind of shared power. It's kind of like Scotland. There's still a movement in Scotland to declare independence, right? And so there still is a sense of alterity there between Scotland and the rest of the UK. There really is. Many people from Scotland, they don't think of themselves as English. If you want to get punched out, go to particularly small towns and rural areas in Scotland and refer to them as English. By the way, the other place to get punched out and probably stabbed is Northern Ireland, unless you're talking to a Protestant. I actually remember getting drunk with a bunch of guys in a bar in Dublin, a pub, sorry. See what an American I am? Alterity, baby. And we were talking about something, and I said something about the English, and I said, well, people are people, and he's like, no, they're not people, they're English. That was in 2006. Okay, so it's not that it goes away. You pose an interesting problem. And Quinn, if in fact you continue to deal with Rwanda, you have a kind of internal alterity between the Hutu and the Tutsi that you're going to have to look at. Because again, remember, this is Reinhardt's 40,000 foot flyover of colonialism. He hasn't even gotten into the kinds of internal alterity that are a consequence of forcing people together into juridically recognized domains that share no history together. Okay. But I think in the case of Wales, which is a kind of peculiar case, it's almost like everyone just got used to it. It's because, you know, you'll find it if you just, forget Wales, if you just go into Northern England, right? And you listen to like that Geordie accent from like Tyneside and stuff like that. Those guys aren't English. I don't know what they are. They come from the earth. I don't know. But that way of speaking and thinking and everything, that real hardcore kind of, have you heard that? You know what I'm talking about, Geordies?
Oh yeah, I absolutely do.
Yeah, okay. It's salt of the earth people, but don't piss them off. You know, you just don't want to do that. And I guess it would be like going into parts of the deep South, and they don't see themselves as part of the same America you're talking about. I mean, they're in their minds, they're still thinking about the Civil War. They really are, and they still resent it. And they hate California. I remember driving through the South and having a sign on my car that says, "No, I'm not from California. This is a rental," because the car had California plates on it. And, you know, I got the feeling that if I hadn't put that there, I'd had the shit knocked out of me about 4 times when I stopped for gas or food, you know? So it doesn't really necessarily go away. I think, and Reinhardt doesn't really speak to this. So what I'm trying to do is not just give you the Bill Hughes theory, but try and think like Reinhardt. I think what he would suggest is that there can be a kind of normalization. Now, Leah in the chat mentioned South Africa. I don't think that that's the same thing. In other words, there is still extraordinary racial tension in South Africa. There is still the view among the majority, you know, sort of ethnically Bantu population in South Africa that particularly the white Afrikaners are intruders and are usurpers and don't belong there. Okay, that's not like Wales and England or Scotland and England as part of the UK. However, I don't think Leah's wrong in suggesting that there's been an attempt at reconciliation through, you know, changing institutions and changing laws and eliminating apartheid and things like that. I mean, I would remind you that, you know, in 1948, apartheid also applied to a certain degree to interactions between the Afrikaner, you know, the Nationalist Party, which had taken over government, and the Anglo-South Africans, the English. There was a tremendous hostility there, often violent, and they were both white. So, you know, identity is a tricky thing. I don't have a good answer for you, Quinn. I love the thinking. Reinhardt doesn't really help us with that. And I think that Wales is, it's not to eliminate the discussion to say Wales is something of a special case. I think perhaps Ireland is a peculiar case as well. But this is the kind of thing that someone analyzing, you know, Wales would have to, because, and its period of colonization was centuries ago. It wasn't like, I mean, remember that most of the countries that you're going to be looking at had just become independent or became independent while I was alive. And I'm old, but I ain't that old. Okay. I mean, you know, that's, I mean, anything after 1957, I was there. I saw it. I helped. I did my part. I smoked a lot then, but, you know, I mean, I did what I could, you know. And yeah, I'm not trying to dodge the question. It's just that I could either give you another 5 hours on that or nothing. Brett, do you have your hand up? I'm sorry.
I do. I was just wondering, I mean, not to get way too off topic.
No.
Separate like the England and Wales question versus like the United States and Hawaii, especially since it is like so far away. Wales is in England, but we kind of took over.
Well, don't tell the Welsh that Wales is in England, okay? I mean, we care about you, man. But no, perfectly legitimate question. And for those of you who have who spend any time in Hawaii, or, you know, I've been very, I never take vacations. Somebody put a gun to my head and said, let's go on vacation, and I had to go to Maui. But I know enough people who've lived on one of the islands to know that there is still very much a sense there of people being occupied. That is still alive, Okay, it's still there. And part of it is racial. I mean, when you go over there and you realize that you're Haole and that you are, it's like being Oyibo in Yoruba, Nigeria. You are an outsider, you're an alien, you're a foreigner. And not even just white, but especially white. It's just like you're there on sufferance. And those tensions are still there and they're still very real. I would suggest that what we kind of see in Wales, we will see more and more in places like Hawaii, not merely because of the distance, it matters, but also because the question of race might likely become less significant 50 years from now. Okay, I mean, the more that we break down the kind of racist barriers against people cohabitating, living together, having children together, the less relevant race will become. Not only will we benefit from hybrid vigor, and I'm a living proof of that, but it's kind of hard to be a racist when you're obviously of, multiracial family or something. It starts to sound weird. But I think Hawaii is a really good case of where there is a kind of what we might call post-colonial, not yet not colonial, but we sort of neo-colonial ethos particularly in parts of Hawaii. I think that would be, is that where you're going, Brett?
Oh, I wasn't planning on it necessarily, but I mean, I've seen it.
But I mean, what I mean is, does that make sense? Does that?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. It does.
Yeah. Okay. But again, getting back more specifically to Reinhardt, it is that notion of alterity, of alien rule. And that beyond the point where that rule is perceived as alien, functionally, you wouldn't think of it as a colony anymore. So Wales doesn't think of Whitehall and Westminster as being alien. They're just different and stupid. I think that's the thing. AJ, you got your hand up? Sometimes I can't see. Okay.
Yeah, no worries. So we've talked a lot about alterity and like this differencing, or I guess the difference, but that kind of confuses me when we talk about like French Algeria or India, where there was like a conscious effort to try to like mingle the populations and make them one. Were they attempting to stop that being a colony? Because I know in French Algeria, there was talk of making Algeria a part of the metropole, to be a true part, a province of France. And that was one of the goals for a while. But do you think that was accurate, or are they still acting kind of colonially there? Because I'm kind of confused. Reinhardt says to be a colony, you need this sense of other. And then there's this attempt to get rid of that.
Okay, that's right. But if you think back to some of Hal's comments about Algeria and violence, and if we're not there yet, but when we get into Fanon and his analysis of Algeria, it's pretty clear that alterity, the persistence of alterity, was what made impossible the kind of synthesis that the French metropole envisioned. That it was just not going to happen. It just wasn't going to happen, because the legacy of the initial alterity of colonialism, of alien rule, was a significant, persistent, and institutionalized disadvantage for non-white, non-French descended peoples in Algeria. And those institutions were so deeply embedded in the culture that they just simply reinforced it, that there was no meaningful way that was going to break down. Fanon would say short of violence. Okay, does that make sense?
It makes sense. So then why would the colonizers push for that? Because like Reinhardt and Machiavelli's view is like the colony is this like outside of the metropole, the place you extract resources, you have to have the sense of other and this control, but then why push to get rid of the one part that's helping you basically get it for cheap, get resources for cheap?
Well, the assumption there was they were trying to stabilize a very violent part of the world. Also, remember that the real the frantic element of that in France begins after the Second World War. Well, remember, there's been a fundamental split within France between Vichy and the sort of resistance and all that kind of stuff. They're trying to reconcile. They form a new republic, okay, and in the midst of doing all that, okay, they've narrowly avoided the ascension of a completely fascist France. So they're in kind of chaos and disrepair internally. So the idea is that we've got to keep Algeria. We've got to keep them as part of France. We can no longer do that, right? if we insist on this kind of really abusive and brutal alterity, this notion of us and them. It's just that the people who were in Algeria, the white Parisians, for example, were having none of it. They were having none of it. Because remember, the idea was that Algerians would have representation in the French parliament and all kinds of things, that ultimately there would be a transition where, just as you have sort of Wales and England, you would have Algeria and France. And it was not going to happen because the Berber population, the Arab population, this sort of dark population in every sense of the word for Europeans, they weren't stupid and they knew what was happening. And after decades and decades and decades of this nonsense, they realized, according to Fanon, there's only one way to do this. We got to kill them, because they're gonna annihilate us. They're gonna kill our culture. They're gonna kill everything about us, and then they're going to permanently impoverish us because they've seen it happening elsewhere in the world. Okay, does that make sense?
Yeah, so that would explain the Raj as well, as they try to do that after.
Yes,
like,
yeah, exactly.
Okay, that makes sense.
Often we'll see this again. Often what happens is the colonized, and this is especially important with World War II, the colonized begin to see, look, these great imperial powers that Machiavelli told us we'd be so afraid of, look, they were defeated in a war with other imperial, they look afraid, they look weak. They die just like we do, and World War I was the preview of that. World War II was the slam dunk. It was on after that. It just took a while, but it began to accelerate very quickly. And especially, again, to get way ahead of where we are right now, as soon as the United States declares itself, however hypocritically, to be anti-colonial, then whether they mean to or not, they're looked at as kind of siding with the colonized rather than the colonizer. Now, in fact, of course, that wasn't true, but it created a contradiction that was another wedge that the colonized could use in their struggles for resistance. Well, look, the United States has the Declaration of Independence. Look at what we're saying. We took it right from the Declaration of Independence. That wasn't an accident. That was deliberate. Yeah. Now, I think it was Leah brought up an interesting question. Why couldn't we consider East Germany to be a colony of the Soviet Union? Well, you can. You can look at any of the so-called satellites and you look at sort of Yalta and all that, and the settlement, the post-war settlement, and you can look at the Eastern Bloc as colonies of the Soviet Union. Of course you can. There were a lot of the elements there. The obvious alterity may not have been there, but it was, because those the administrative apparatus was either occupied by ethnic Russians, or the imperial oversight of Moscow was so profound that functionally you could make an absolutely convincing argument that East Germany was a colony, that Bulgaria was a colony, that Poland was a colony, that they were colonies of the Soviet Union. You could. Now, again, that would be a kind of modern, in quotes, post-colonial imperialism, right? But there's no question that a lot of the dynamics are there. If you look at like Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, places like that within the Soviet Union, you can describe that as colonialism. I had a professor of Russian studies in graduate school who was the first person who really kind of took my head and turned it around and said, Hughes, look, this is colonialism. And I'm like, shit, it is. And then I backed off and I, eventually kind of, corrected my perspective. Because I had never thought about the Soviet Union as a colonial empire in that sense. Well, it makes sense. Of course it was. Of course it was. So yeah, I think that was Leah. Of course you could do that. I think it would be hard to analyze East Germany in the same sense of colonialism that we're talking about for this class, but I don't think it would be impossible. But that would be a difficult one to take on. Okay. Okay, so the other thing is this notion of asymmetry or development gap. Okay, and it's practical asymmetry that Reinhardt's talking about. All right, there was a kind of a popular little ditty that, in fact, some English school children learned And the sort of punchline of it was with respect to colonialism, we can do all these things. And the last line was, for we have the Maxim gun and they have not. What was a Maxim gun?
It was a machine gun.
A very large, powerful machine gun. Now, again, you can have, you know, a platoon of men with a Maxim gun and go up against a couple of hundred people at that time who might have, you know, sticks and the occasional knife, and you just sweep them out. Not only is it awe-inspiring in terms of maximum violence, that's a lesson that people learn. It gets back to that Machiavellian notion of they'll just fear you. Okay. What Reinhardt in that Machiavellian sense then might be trying to suggest is it's not that you're superior in every element of your society. That's not the point, but you have the Maxim gun and they have not. Whatever it is that allows you to facilitate that colonial domination, you've got it and they haven't. Because if they had it, they'd meet you on the field of battle, politically, diplomatically, economically, whatever it was, and you would strive for dominance. But that's not what's happened. Okay? So those two things, the key, I think, to Reinhardt's perspective on colonialism is those two things: alien rule, alterity, and that asymmetry. Okay. Getting back to the Wales question, for example, you could even argue that one of the things that attenuated the sense of colonialism between England and Wales was the Welsh knew how valuable the stuff under the ground was to the empire. They knew if they were going to go down in those pits, you know, and bring up that coal, they learned very quickly, you know what, if we stop doing that, we shut down the metropole. When coal miners started going out on strikes and demonstrating and doing things like that because of the horrendous conditions of coal mining and the fact that there were, you know, 6-year-old kids going down on those pits, ultimately England had to kind of relent, you know. And by the way, we saw those struggles continuing well into the 1970s and Thatcherism. Okay, so those weren't just ancient things, but that really conscious notion of us and them and alien rule was pretty much gone. It doesn't, I would suggest, maybe beyond what Reinhardt would do, once it's gone doesn't mean it's gone forever. It doesn't. But if it's gone, whatever you got there isn't what Reinhardt at least would recognize as a colony. Now, we can differ on that. You can differ on that. I'm just trying to make sure that you understand these are, if you want to break down Reinhardt's whole analysis of colonialism, the key elements of that are the notions of alterity and alien rule and this idea of sort of asymmetry in development. Okay? Are there any questions on that? Yeah, Paul. I'm sorry, Brett. You jumped there. Somebody went
so
on.
the development gap was at first used to kind of keep the colonies in line. At what point was it just the development gap to where industrialized nations started competing with each other to see who could be the most advanced, or was it also a shift in economic theory where, you know, wealth could be created? It was no longer a zero-sum game, and you could create wealth without capturing physical land to pull the resources out.
Well, at the time that we're talking about, which would be roughly, I would suggest, probably from the 17th through the 19th centuries, excuse me, the ultimate source of wealth still, even with industrialization, land was incredibly valuable. Land and the resources contained on that land were valuable, okay? That's still true. A lot of what if you look at the American economy, for example, and people will say, well, oh, we're creating all these jobs. And isn't that great? You know, unemployment's coming back down and it got down below 4%. Isn't that great? Well, not really. Not when most of those jobs are in the service sector. Okay. Meaning they're relatively low paying, low benefits or no benefits, and insecure kinds of employment. Okay. There's not a lot of wealth being created there. It's being created by those people, but it's not, you know, it still requires resources. There are only so many services that you can offer that people will buy unless you have pockets of affluence, either here or elsewhere in the world, okay? And so, you know, resources still matter. It's just that we now get a lot of our resources from other places, right? Well, Kyle's pointing out, Kyle, you want to follow up on that? I don't want to speak for you.
Oh yeah, I've forgotten the name now. But having studied history of economic thought, like pre-Smith, you get this, it's like tableau of economics, and there's this there's an idea from a couple of French authors that the only thing that actually gains money is land, and everything else is like weirdly traded in between, and then like eventually like your agricultural sector is the only thing that actually profits from it. So pretty clearly, at least in early economic theory, land is seen as incredibly important and sometimes like the only thing that actually earns you anything. So in the wake of that kind of perspective, you can see why colonial lands become really important.
Well, I think what Brett's talking about, and Brett, if you're not, I apologize, is doesn't this really change as we industrialize? Because when you're industrializing, in other words, yeah, it's resource hungry. Of course,
I know it does. Yeah, I know
you still need ore. You still need wood. You still need all the raw materials. However, you're generating much more wealth from those raw materials. You're not just taking that wood and burning it in someone's home as heat. You're using that, you know, theoretically, let's say, you know, to heat metal, to form that metal into heaters, you know, or something. That is, you're expanding the capacity to generate wealth beyond merely what land directly can yield. Brett, is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, basically. I mean, yeah, not to argue that economic theory was wrong, just that it shifted. Like they no longer.
It was, yeah. But,
yeah. Oh, I think you're right.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right. And also, what we see after that point is, guess what else shifts? The modalities of colonialism. Because now, when you look at late 19th and especially early 20th century colonialism, there's a big push to begin in a very limited way to stimulate some small-scale manufacture in these colonies. In other words, it's no longer just extraction of, you know, palm oil or gold or diamonds or whatever, but, you know, where there's the capacity for skilled labor, it's like, okay, we're going to have like you're going to make a bicycle factory, or you're going to make we're going to have some sort of refinery here, or something like that. We're going to expand your industrial capacity. Now it's all going to be controlled by the metropole, and all the wealth from it is going to be extracted by the metropole. When oil was discovered in Nigeria, there's a classic example. Oil is worthless without industrialization. Okay, and so Nigeria's entire political economy changes after the discovery of oil. Okay. But it had been a colony long before oil was discovered or seen as value, okay, having value, okay? And so as economic theory changes because the means of production change, the theories of colonialism change along with it. Now, they may lag behind a little bit, but I think Brett's point is that the larger point, colonialism as a model is not static, any more than economics as a model is static. Things adapt to externalities, they change. Okay, and colonialism clearly, Brett, if this is what you're suggesting, colonialism absolutely was compelled to adapt to the realities of industrialization. Yeah, industrial colonialism is different from pre-industrial colonialism, which again is why we're not going back 300 years, 400 years. Yeah, I think that's a great point. It's absolutely a great point. It absolutely fits really well into what we're going to talk about on Thursday, which is we're going to talk about some of the sort of moving parts of the kind of technological and material motivations for colonialism. And this is going to be me talking. And this is, I call it ships, capitalism, and guns. Okay. And in other words, if you want to talk about asymmetry, talk about ships, capitalism, and guns. You know, but more likely all these technological innovations become important. But capitalism becomes an extraordinary engine of innovation, but also of destruction. All right, the notion of capitalism as creative destruction is nowhere more evident than in the expansions of empire into the realm of colonial possession. Okay, and that's what I want to talk about on Thursday. All right, so I think we've gone far enough. Yeah, I've given you a lot to chew on. What I'd like you to read, and the reading is relatively light this time around because I want to be a relatively brief module, because I want to get into decolonization. But read the Wolfgang Reinhardt piece. It's very, very short. And then read the one on the scramble for Africa, because that'll give you an idea of, well, what was this big rush for sub-Saharan, in particular sub-Saharan Africa? What was going on there, and why did that happen? Okay, and we'll pick up with that and things like it when we talk about the early voyages of discovery and all that, from a kind of materialist perspective, which we'll do on Thursday. All right, was there anything else? Any questions that I didn't have a chance to respond to, or anything where maybe I missed you or something? All right, did everybody sign in? If you didn't, could you real quickly do that? Before, and if not, you can, I'm gonna leave this running for just a second in case somebody hasn't signed in yet. Otherwise, you can depart, and I will hopefully see all of you on Thursday.
Hey, Bill, I just had one thing to say. I don't know if you've closed the first module yet.
No, you know what? I'm not. I made notes, so I don't have to close it.
Okay, because
I'm
I'm
just keep adding.
I was planning on submitting it this morning, and I've just had a hectic day. Been trying
No,
to.
I thought about that, and I thought really what I did was I went in and just I created a big document of everybody's stuff,
Okay.
and I thought that's easier. That way, if you want to continue to add to that, you can, and it'll be in a
Yeah,
place
that would
for you
be-
because it'll help you for your midterm.
Okay.
No, absolutely, don't worry, Paul. Yeah.
I've spent all morning trying to teach my 7-year-old how to do Zoom meetings, and it's been, it's
They
been
probably
hectic.
dig it.
Oh no.
No?
it's I mean it's a little bit, but when it comes to it's like I have become a full-time teacher because I spent hours trying to get him to like log into this program where he can do math problems, and when you spend 25 minutes troubleshooting a login for
Yeah.
a program with 7 teachers and the IT guy from Bellevue, and
Yeah, that's no fun. That's no fun.
no, but I will submit that. I'll get that into the.
You've got as much time as you want now because I've already got a sense of where everybody else is, and you're not going to
Okay.
mark late or anything, so don't worry about it.
All right, awesome. Well, thank you. I'll see you
Okay.
on.
Okay, guys, anything else? Brett, if you're talking, your mic's off.
Yep, I was. I'm over in the chat. I've been chit-chatting about economic theory and the history.
All right. Do you need me for anything?
I don't believe so.
All right, then I'm going to log out.
Sounds good.
Okay.
See you guys.